ever read a book that stole your heart and then broke it into a million pieces? One that made you laugh like you were sharing a joke with your best friend and then made you cry like you were at that best friend's funeral? Well, if you have, then chances are the book that you were reading was this one, Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. Now, Lonesome Dove is a heavily character-driven novel, and the characters are so tangible and genuine, and they feel so real. And the reason that they feel so real to us is because they're based on real historical figures, who I'm going to introduce you to in this video of History by the Book. Now, if a book about cowboys in the Old West doesn't seem like your thing, well, I understand that because I felt the same way. When I initially heard about this book, I thought, well, I'm not really into westerns or cowboys and never been on a cattle drive, so it wasn't something that was really interesting to me. But then I kept seeing book reviewers whose opinions I respect talking about how great this book was. And so I thought, well, okay, I'm going to give it a chance. I'm not going to like it, and I'll probably DNF it. Oh, dear reader, I have never been more wrong about anything in my life, ever. This book has become one of my all-time favorite books that I have ever read. So if you think that this book isn't for you, I would highly suggest that you give it a try, because I think you might be surprised. And though it's a bit of a chunkster, your efforts will be well rewarded. Now, Lonesome Dove is the third book in a 4-part series. And while it's not the first book, it is undoubtedly the most popular book. Now, I have a question for you. I haven't read any of the other books in the series yet, so I'm not sure if I want to read the next book in the series or if I want to go back to the beginning and start from there. So if you've read all the books, let me know. And also, if you've read Lonesome Dove, let me know your thoughts, even if you didn't like it. Now, Lonesome Dove was published in 1985 and was awarded the Pulitzer in 1986. And the book didn't start out as a novel. It actually started out as a screenplay for a film that was going to have John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, and Henry Fonda in it. But John Wayne didn't like the script, and he didn't like the character that he was going to be cast as, so McMurtry took the script back from the studio and began to craft his masterpiece. Now, he got the name for the book when he saw an advertisement painted on a side of a bus for Lonesome Dove Baptist Church. Now, McMurtry didn't really understand what the big deal was about this book. It wasn't his favorite, and he couldn't understand why people liked it so much because he thought it was just kind of average. Now, it's this part of the video where I have to give you a little bit of a warning here. If you haven't read Lonesome Dove, there are going to be spoilers in this video. And I try very hard to keep spoilers out of my video. But the historical figures and the characters in the book kind of mirror each other with some pretty major events. And it's impossible for me to tell you about the historical characters without giving away some of those events. So if you think that you're going to read Lonesome Dove at any time in your life, I would suggest that you come back to this video after you've read the book. And it's not that I want to encourage you to not watch my videos. I want you to watch my videos. But I also want you to have the same incredible reading experience that I did with this book. Now, if you're still watching, I'm going to assume that you've read the book, and so I don't need to go into any big plot reviews or tell you what happens and when because, well, I'm assuming you've read the book. Now, the story revolves around two main characters, Woodrow F. Call and Augustus McCrae, two retired Texas Rangers who come together to form the Hat Creek Cattle Company. Now, the character of the stoic Woodward F. Call was inspired by a historical figure named Charles Goodnight. Now, Charles Goodnight was born in Illinois in 1836, and after his father passed away and his mother remarried, the family up and moved to Texas in 1846. And Goodnight spent some of his younger years on a cattle ranch learning the cattle trade. But in 1857, he joined the Texas Rangers, and he earned a reputation as an exceptional tracker, along with his incredible ability to find water sources based on watching the movements of animals and being able to identify various plant life. Now, during the Civil War, he acted as a scout for the Confederacy. And in 1864, Goodnight returned to cattle ranching, and he kept a large herd of cattle and was even experimenting with crossbreeding them with bison with the intent of creating a new kind of livestock he called cataloes. But alas, the catalo wasn't to be. And while that experiment wasn't actually a great success for Goodnight, what he did do was help preserve the American bison from going into extinction. The American bison was being slaughtered by buffalo hunters in order to strip a major food source from the American Indians. And by Goodnight keeping this large herd of bison on his ranch, he was able to keep them from going extinct. And as a matter of fact, some of the descendants of Goodnight's original herd are still out wandering the plains in places like Yellowstone. Now, in 1866, Goodnight would partner up with another cattleman named Oliver Loving, who would be the inspiration for the lovable Gus McCrae. Now, in 1866, Oliver Loving and Charles Goodnight got together and made a cattle drive to Fort Sumner in New Mexico to supply the army with beef. And that trail became known as the Goodnight Loving Trail. Now, originally, 700 miles would extend into 2,000, and the Goodnight Loving Trail would become the primary route for driving cattle from Texas as far as into Wyoming. Now, while it became the main route for a lot of other cattlemen to drive their cattle up to various places up in the Northwest, it was by no means an easy journey. They had things like hailstorms and thunderstorms. They had to deal with things like locusts and rattlesnakes and bandits who were waiting on the trail for someone to come along. Not only that, they were traveling through Comanche Indian territory, and the Comanches weren't exactly thrilled about white men traveling through their backyards. So there were a lot of dangers that were involved with this trail. And even with all that going on, the trail remained in use until about the 1880s when the railroads came in. Now, Goodnight is also credited with the invention of the chuck wagon, but ranchers and pioneers had been using a kind of mobile kitchen for many years. Now, Goodnight himself lived an adventurous and very profitable life, and he died at the incredible age of 93 on December 12th, 1929. Now, as I stated before, the character of Augustus McCrae, or Gus as he's mostly known in the story, was based on Oliver Loving. Now, Oliver Loving was born on December 4th, 1812 in Hopkins, Kentucky. And in 1843, Oliver, along with his wife Susan, moved their family to Texas. By 1857, Oliver Loving had amassed a huge herd of cattle and about 1,000 acres of land to keep them on. And when the Civil War broke out in 1861, Oliver Loving was commissioned to supply beef for the Confederate forces. And at the end of the war, the Confederates owed him about $100,000. The only problem was that the Confederates, well, they had lost, and so their money was basically worthless. Now in 1866, at the age of 54, Oliver Loving partnered up with Charles Goodnight, and the two set out on the Goodnight-Loving Trail to support Fort Sumter with beef. Now, the venture paid off big time for them because they were paid with gold in the amount of about $12,000, which would have been an absolute fortune back then. Now, the success of this drive inspired them to make future ones. And it was on one of these future expeditions or cattle drives, this is where things, well, they took a turn for the worse. Goodnight and Loving were setting out on one of their cattle drives, and Loving decided that he was going to go ahead and try to negotiate some contracts a little bit further up the trail, while while Goodnight stayed back with the cattle. Now, Oliver Loving took a scout with him by the name of Bill Wilson, and the two of them set out. Now, Loving was warned to only travel at night, and for a while, Loving did this. But after a while, he decided he didn't like traveling at night, and he made the decision to travel by day. Now, Loving was an experienced cattleman, and he had survived several Indian attacks. He had actually been involved in one, I believe, also with Charles Goodnight, where they went into a camp to rescue a woman who, well, she didn't really want to be rescued because she had been living with the Indian tribe for something like 20 years and even had a son with one of the Indians. But Oliver Loving's confidence in his abilities was sadly a little overstated, because when they started to travel by day, this is when the trouble began. One afternoon, they ran into some Comanches, and Oliver Loving was shot in the arm. And while that doesn't sound like it could have been too bad of an injury, you have to remember they're out in the middle of nowhere in this incredible heat, and Loving is bleeding out of his arm. And they only have, I believe they only had 1 or 2 shotguns between them, and these Indians were tracking them for a couple of days, and they were pretty much surrounded. So Loving decided to send Bill Wilson back to the camp to get help. So Bill Wilson made it out and made the 100-mile journey back to find Goodnight and the rest of the cowboys. He made this 100-mile journey on foot. Now, when Wilson got back to the camp, he told Charles Goodnight what had happened, and Goodnight immediately set out to find Loving. Now, Loving had survived 3 days out in the desert in the brutal heat. He was bleeding out. Gangrene was setting in. By some stroke of luck, he was found by some Mexican travelers who took him to Fort Sumter and got him to the fort and got him some medical help. But we're talking mid to late 1800s, and well, medicine wasn't what it is now. Loving did have his arm amputated, but it was too late. Gangrene had set in and was already overtaking his body. Now, Goodnight did make it to the camp in time to see Loving before he passed away. And Loving made him promise that he would take his body back to Texas. Oliver Loving died on October 25th, 1867, and good to his word, Charles Goodnight took his friend's body back to Texas. Now, there is some speculation, depending on what sites you're looking at or what sources you're reading, that it wasn't Goodnight who took Oliver Loving's body back to Texas. It was actually his son. But as you know in the book, it is Call who takes Gus's body back home. Call and McCrae weren't the only characters who were based on real-life historical figures. Another one of the favorite characters in the book, at least for me anyway, was Joshua Dietz. And Joshua Dietz was based on a man named Bose Ikard, who was born into slavery in Mississippi in 1843. Now, after the war, Bose Ikard was a freed man, and he went to go and work for Oliver Loving as a trail driver. Now, after Loving's death, he went to work for Goodnight in 1867. Now, Ikard served as a trail guide and a tracker, and also as Goodnight's banker, as Goodnight trusted him to carry large amounts of money while they traveled back and forth on the Goodnight Loving Trail. Now, Goodnight and Ikard bonded over a mutual respect, with Goodnight stating that he trusted Ikard farther than any living man. Now, Ikard eventually wanted to go and settle in Colorado, but Goodnight convinced him to stay in Texas. And Ikard would settle in Texas, and he would marry a woman named Angelina, and together they would have 15 children. Now, Ikard died in January of 1929, and Goodnight bought a headstone for his grave and had it inscribed with, Bose Ikard served with me for 4 years on the Goodnight Loving Trail, never shirked a duty or disobeyed an order, rode with me in many stampedes, participated in 3 engagements with Comanches, splendid behavior. And if you've read the book, you know that this is a very similar inscription to what Call has put on Joshua Dietz's headstone. Now, both Oliver Loving and Bose Ikard are buried in Weatherford, Texas, at the Greenwood Cemetery. Now, Blue Duck, who is one of the villains in the story, was actually a real Indian outlaw. He rode with gangs and was involved in robberies and cattle rustling. However, the character of Blue Duck in the book was actually based on Santanta, a fierce Kiowa warrior who was involved in wagon train attacks in which 7 people were murdered. Now, Santanta was caught, arrested, and convicted of murder, and he was sentenced to hang. But the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. And for some reason in 1873, Santanta was paroled, but he quickly went back to his old ways and engaged in some violent raids against buffalo hunters and federal troops. And in 1874, Santanta was arrested again and put in jail for life. But Santanta decided that wasn't the life for him. And in 1878, Santanta committed suicide by jumping out of the window of the jail. Now, there also was a real-life Jake Spoon, but he was nothing at all like the character. The real Jake Spoon was born in 1864, and even though he had made a couple of trips between Texas and Kansas, I believe, he was quite the opposite of the Jake Spoon in the novel, and he would probably be a little bit unhappy or even insulted that his name was used for such an unsavory character. Now, the real Jake Spoon died in 1922, and he's buried in the Pioneers Rest Cemetery in Fort Worth, Texas. Now, when he was asked who his favorite character in the book was, Larry McMurtry stated that was Lorena Wood, and she is the tragic young woman who survived the rough and tumble life of the Old West by prostitution. Now, the character of Lorena isn't based on a single historical figure. Rather, she's a complex consolidation of a group of women who are referred to as soiled doves. Now, while there were some limited opportunities for a single woman to survive in the Old West, some women were seamstresses, or artists, or musicians, or teachers, but a lot of them were left with few options other than prostitution in order to survive. And that occupation was just as dangerous, if not more so, than herding cattle. I mean, women like Lorena faced threats of violence from their customers, venereal disease, botched abortions, and it also led to things like substance abuse and suicide. Now, the things that Lorena faced were far more tragic and damaging and more horrifying than anything any of the male characters face in the book. And to me, that makes her the real hero of this story. Now, if you found this video interesting, please give it a like and consider subscribing, because that helps me to know that you want me to keep making videos like this. And again, if you've read Lonesome Dove, I'd really love to know your thoughts. If you could put them in the comments below. And I want to say thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time on History by the Book.